I'm here with Gordon Wright, and we're going to be talking about understanding our times. Gordon, until recently, Christianity was seen as kind of a default religion in Canada with a lot of respect and influence, and obviously that's changed. So the question is, how do we as followers of Christ respond to this new reality?
Yeah, it's happened really fast, eh? It seems like, we've kind of found ourselves on the fringes of society, and sometimes that doesn't bring out the best responses in us, right? But I'm kind of encouraged because in our weakness now, I think we can find God's strength in a really powerful way. We're living in this obviously challenging society, and we can respond in one of two ways: in fear, and that will make us sort of paranoid and maybe kind of nasty around the edges, or we can respond in faith and in love, and I think that's God's better plan. Peter writes, live such good lives among your unbelieving neighbors, that though they might accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your good actions and give glory to God. So that's kind of the challenge for us, I think.
Thank you. And of course, the Bible's a great reference point for us.
Right.
Are there characters that you think of when you consider the situation that we're in?
Yeah, for sure. Daniel comes to mind right away, because I think his situation is really analogous to ours in so many ways, and can kind of help us to understand. We might feel like we're in kind of an exile. He was in a real exile. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had come into Israel and cleared out many of the sort of brightest and best, including a lot of young men that he brought into this 3-year training program, really to try to make them into Babylonians. And people from every culture were made into this robots that would sort of do the king's business as civil servants in this sort of massive empire, one of the biggest in world history to that time. And so Daniel found himself in this really huge, scary re-education program. And he was trained for 3 years in the culture of Babylon, and they were educated to think and worship and act like Babylonians. And I'm sure they must have thought, God, we are so small and this is so big, but like, how big are you? How can we be a blessing in this place? How can we be faithful to God in a place like this?
So Israel's captivity in Babylon, that's not far off maybe how we might feel today. So my question to you, how did Israel respond? And how did Daniel react to being in this kind of a culture? And what are the pitfalls that you could see they could have fallen into?
Yeah, first off, I think it's important to recognize that for them and for us, not everything is bad. Not everything about Babylon was bad. Not everything about our culture is bad. In Babylon, first off, there was a lot of science. There was a lot of resources. There were a lot of benefits to the knowledge. There was medical knowledge they could learn, history and mathematics. There was actually a lot of great opportunity there that they could learn. Obviously, there was some real challenges, some things we would say that were bad, and difficult about their world. The astrology, the pagan gods, the magic, And so the idea was, let's obliterate everything, even down to their names being changed. So Daniel's name, God is my judge, changed to a name that was really honoring a pagan god. And so every time he was called for breakfast, it was, hey, pagan god, Bel is your prince, kind of thing, every single time. And the amazing thing to me is the extent of their cooperation in that. For 3 years, they made no complaint. They participated in some of the instruction that would have been abhorrent to them as Jewish young men, trying to discern the future by dissecting sheep livers or noting unusual birth patterns or a certain way that a bird would fly or whatever, spells, all sorts of things that would, for them, they would have said, this is ridiculous, this isn't how God operates. And yet they cooperated even with that learning process, which is fascinating to me. And so cooperation was sort of their default position. They didn't sort of walk around with, God hates pagan placards or that kind of thing. They didn't attempt to change the society. They rather wanted to be faithful to God in it. And I think the key to that was that they obviously had a vital devotional life. First of all, they had community. Daniel wasn't alone. He had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Not their names either. Those were all changed. But he was friends with these guys on a deep, deep level, and I think that community was really, really helpful. And that vital devotional life that ultimately helped them to succeed in a pagan society.
So Daniel and his friends, this community, were generally being cooperative and adapting to their society. But Gordon, where do you draw the line on that?
There is such a great phrase there. Daniel determined not to defile himself. And I think, well, all that stuff he was doing, didn't that defile him? Apparently not. And then there was this one thing that he thought might defile him, and it's really interesting. He wouldn't compromise the core of who he was. He could participate in a lot of these things, but somehow the core of who he was. So education, sure. Magic, astrology, yeah, I can learn that. And so that he did. But there was this one thing that would be a compromise for him, and it's actually hard for us to figure out why. It was this food. It was the diet of the king. And you think, well, what was specific about that diet? And I'm not sure it was actually the food itself, but what it meant. To sit at a king's table meant that he was providing for you. All your success was from the king. And on that, he was going, because all my success comes from God. And so the patronage of the king, the sitting at his table and making the assumption that all that I am is from the king, he says, no, my success is from God. And I think for that reason, he knew that he would defile himself if he ate of that food.
Okay, so Daniel determined what he wasn't going to do, right? He drew that line. Where did he go from there?
I love the phrase, courage with creativity. He didn't just say, I'm not eating your slimy food, you pagan. That would have been a bad idea anyway, but that wasn't his response even in his heart, Rather, he very respectfully approached his direct superior and came up with a creative alternative. Didn't even bring the three guys into it because he didn't want to necessarily hurt them, just let's try this out. Let's try a creative alternative. So could we try this for 10 days and let's just see how it goes. So he basically came up with a creative solution, a win-win solution, where even his immediate superior, who, let's face it, if things went bad, he'd be in trouble too. So it had to be a win for the superior. Now, how do you get that kind of wisdom? I think we find out later it's because he prayed 3 times a day, because he was in contact with God, and God gave him that wisdom in the moment.
So, an incredible role model in Daniel.
Yeah.
What are the lessons for us today in that story?
Yeah, how to thrive in, first off, I'm thinking of students, in university, high school, whatever. Like, how do you thrive in a secular environment as a student? Do you correct the teacher every time he makes a statement that's not true? Daniel didn't do that, So maybe it isn't that we take on a big argument with the teacher every time, but respectfully learn how to work in the environment without compromising ourselves, So spiritual and intellectual pursuits are not mutually exclusive. We can succeed spiritually and also intellectually in whatever pursuit or discipline that we happen to be in. I betcha Daniel was the very best at dissecting sheep livers or whatever it was. He did a really good job of what he learned. So much so that he and his friends were given top posts in 4 successive administrations, even changes of empires. He still continued to rise to the top in 4 different. So there was something about his character, something about the quality that he brought to his day-to-day work that, God honored him, obviously, but also in the eyes of those emperors and rulers, they saw the excellence of his work, and so he honored God in that way. So I guess for us, we live in a secular society. It's like, are we going to spend all our time moaning about it or trying to change it or fighting against it, or do we just say, you know what, here's where we are, here's where God has placed us at this time. How can I be excellent for God? How can I show the love of God in the most beautiful ways, and how can I be creative in doing that when I come up against challenges?
So, is this always going to work out?
No, No, even though his default position was cooperation, determining his convictions, knowing where the line was, and having courage with creativity, all those good things we've said, we just got to read a few chapters later, although it's a whole lot later in his life, but he's in the lion's den, right? Because he couldn't do this forever. But the fact that that might come someday, let's not jump there first, I think is the lesson from Daniel. Cooperate on as much as we can until we no longer can, and we determine where that line is in humility and in prayer before God. But we cooperate as much as we can, and I think that's a huge lesson from Daniel.
Gordon, thank you very much. Insights from Daniel and insights for us today. And thank you for joining us with this video today.